Well, good evening. It's good to be back up here and to speak to you all. This evening, I am going to talk about one of my favorite books of the Bible. And it actually is in contention. I think I can say with confidence, it is my favorite book of the Bible, and I'll tell you why in here in a moment. That book is Ecclesiastes. So this is actually a two-part lesson. I was preparing this for Edwards Lake, and I wanted to talk about Ecclesiastes, and I was putting the lesson together, and I realized very quickly I wasn't going to fit it all into 45 minutes, so I said, let's split it up into two. In 2024, I've been reading the Bible through in a year since probably about 2016. After a while of going Genesis to Revelation, I got a little tired of that. I would do it, just by the books of the Bible, and then I would do it chronologically. And then last year I decided I wanted to do something different. I felt stronger in some areas than others, so I wanted to work on the Gospels and one proverb a day, because there's 31 days in a month typically, and so that gives you one proverb a day. And so I read one chapter in the Gospels a day, one chapter in Proverbs in a day, and one chapter in Ecclesiastes in a day. And so if you do the math very quickly, if you read one chapter of Proverbs every day in a year, you're going to read through the book of Proverbs 12 times, once a month. If you read through one chapter a day in the Gospels, you'll read all four Gospels in a quarter, so you're going to read through all four Gospels 4 times. And if you read one chapter out of Ecclesiastes, which has 12 chapters, one chapter a month, you will read the book of Ecclesiastes over 30 times. And it wasn't until I prepared for this lesson that I realized, holy cow, I just read Ecclesiastes 30 times in 2024. And so what I want to do this evening is give you the key takeaways that I had from reading Ecclesiastes 30 times. Or at least not all of my key takeaways are tonight. The first key takeaway is that no matter how many times I read it, I saw something new every time. And this isn't unique to the book of Ecclesiastes, right? It's the Bible in general. You read Genesis through Revelation, you're going to come back to Leviticus, and you're going to read things like kings shouldn't amass great wealth and a lot of wives and a lot of horses and chariots. And then you're going to go, oh yeah, I remember last time I read through the scriptures, Solomon did all those things. And so going through things multiple times make things come rushing to you and stick out to you. But there's a phrase that I love. It's from Heraclitus. That guy. It says, no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man. So picture yourself going on a hike, and to cross the river, you walk through the river, you go do your hike, and then you come back. Let's say your route comes back through the same spot in the river. The water has moved, some of the animals have moved, maybe the rocks have moved. It's a new river, and you have had experiences since the last time you stepped in that river. And so the analogy is not perfect. The Bible is unchanging. The Bible is the river here. But from the time you read that passage, whatever it is last time, to the time you read it this time, you've read other passages, you've thought about other things, and you've had other experiences. And sometimes you're going to come back to that verse and something's going to pop out. How many times you read something and you're like, I don't remember ever reading this before? And sometimes you'll go, I've read this 100 times. And it hasn't had that impact that it just did when I read that. Well, that's what the book of Ecclesiastes did for me. And when I read it twice a month, that really, really helped. And so there's one thing I will say. There is nothing that I can say this evening that will accomplish what the writer of Ecclesiastes is trying to do. I can't lecture my way into getting you to get out of the book what the author wanted you to do. It's only through immersing yourself into the book yourself, you have to do it, that you'll be able to get out of it what you're supposed to. But what I can do tonight is help you understand the book and its purpose, and most importantly for tonight's lesson, is how you should approach it as you read it. And so to do that, I'm going to point out a few things that I learned from the book by reading it 30 times. And in this lesson, I'm going to point a few things out of the book generally, and Lord willing, in part 2, I'll go through some of the themes that are outlined in the book. And as a side note, I don't say, hey, I read it 30 times out of like pride or anything. I just thought that was really cool that you can read the Bible, or you can read a book through 30 times in 1 year as long as you stay at it. The book of Ecclesiastes is very unique. You're going to hear some of Martin's lesson this morning in my sermon, or you heard some of my lesson in Martin's Bible study this morning, and probably some of Rose too, because as they were up here this morning, they said a lot of things, and I'm like, it always happens though. It's always like, oh, you're stepping on my lesson, man. And I've stopped thinking of it like that. I've started thinking it like, thank you for helping me make my points. They're not just hearing it from Jeremiah. It's wonderful how the Bible works that way. So, as Martin said to me before the lesson, there's no other book in the Bible like Ecclesiastes. And I'm actually going to talk about that. The first thing that is unique to Ecclesiastes, this is one of my first takeaways, you've got to understand before you even open the book, is that it is Hebrew meditation literature. In my notes, meditation literature is in all caps, and I should have done that on here. It's not American literature, and we shouldn't read it like we read typical books. A lot of times, and I think this is right-hearted, we want to know what to do or what not to do in God's eyes. And so we will open up our Bibles and say, God, what do you think about this? And that's right a lot of times. But when you only do that, that can lead you astray. This is not just a rule book. And in many cases, it's not a rule book. It's supposed to change your heart. That will change your actions. But we cannot treat it like a law book. It's also not intended to have one conclusion for every topic under the sun. And I'll show you what I mean by that. In America, and as Americans, and certainly as Christians in this group, maybe I can't speak for you all, we like to have a yes or no answer for every question. And there are things that God has not told us about in the Bible. And therefore it doesn't, if he hasn't spoken on it, then okay. But if he has spoken on it, then thus saith the Lord. But we don't like it when we don't know the answer to something, when we don't know something to be sure of. And so Ecclesiastes made me uncomfortable. And I'll talk about that. It's not meant for you to say, well, this means X, Y, Z, and then move on with your life. You're supposed to, in Ecclesiastes, you're supposed to sit with it. Whatever the writer of Ecclesiastes is talking at that time, you're supposed to sit with it and ponder it and apply it. Not read it as if it's Old Testament law, right? You're supposed to take it with you throughout all your day and see the application all around you, maybe even in your own life. And here's the point. Ultimately, let it change your mind, change your perspective, and change your outlook on life. So that's the first thing that's unique about Ecclesiastes, the key takeaway that I had. It's Hebrew meditation literature. The second thing is it is wisdom literature, but it's different from Proverbs and Job, right? And so I'm going to use a couple words. Hopefully you'll get my point, right? All three, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, they ponder these questions. How to be wise in this world? What does it mean to live well in this world or under this sun? How do I live the good life? Or how do I be good at living life on this earth? And so to tackle those questions, Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes do it in very different ways. Sometimes they overlap. In Proverbs, you learn that if you're wise, things will go well for you. The righteous are rewarded. The wicked are punished, and you get what you deserve. So let's look at a couple of these verses. They're all on the slide. We'll stay mostly in Ecclesiastes. This is just what I call belt-fed verses right here, one after another, to prove the point of that Proverbs is optimistic, right? In chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, my son, do not forget my teaching, but keep my commands in your heart. Why? Because they will prolong your life many years and bring you peace and prosperity. And so it's at this time I feel obliged to tell you that Proverbs is not a this, then that, guaranteed every time. They're generalities that if you are wise, this will happen. If you are foolish, this will happen. But in the Bible, we see that isn't always the case. That's our goal, to strive towards those things. But it doesn't always happen that way, and I'm about to give you some examples just from Scripture. Chapter 11, verse 18, the wicked person, he earns deceptive wages, but the one who sows righteousness, well, he's going to reap a sure reward. Optimistic, right? 12:21, no harm overtakes the righteous, but the wicked have their full of trouble. How many wicked people we know that do not have their fill of trouble? Right? A lot of them. 13:21, disaster pursues sinners. You can kind of picture that, a sinner being pursued by disaster. But the righteous, they're rewarded with good things. And 22:4, the reward for humility and the fear of the Lord is riches and honor and life. That's my favorite because I always smile and I go, I don't doubt it. It's optimistic. Let's switch to Job very quickly. One verse, all you need to see. We know the book of Job, right? It's kind of depressing if you let it be, right? It has a great ending, but boy, it's a lot of chapters to get to that happy ending. Job is more pessimistic. It says that even if you live a wise and righteous life, God even calls him righteous, things can and will go badly for you. Look at what he says in Job 12:6. The tents of the destroyers prosper, and those who provoke God, they're secure, whom God brings into their power. God put them there. And so quite the opposite theme, right? So Proverbs is very optimistic, and Job's like, hey, I've seen bad people get good things. Somebody said it standing right here this morning. Bad people get good things, and good people get bad things. And so Job very much stands on that high ground and says, this is what I see, right? And you have to wrestle with that. But Ecclesiastes, if I were to say optimistic, pessimistic, and I had to label Ecclesiastes, it's realistic because it does both. It says life here under the sun, there it is meaningless or vanity, depending on your translation. We'll come back to that. Turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 7. So just like Proverbs gives you the optimistic side, and Job gives you the pessimistic side, Ecclesiastes within 2 verses you're about to see is going to give you both. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 12. It says, for wisdom is protection, just as money is protection. But the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the lives of its possessors. Boy, that sounds awfully optimistic, right? Go down to verse 15. This is the writer here, he says, or the preacher, he says, I have seen everything during my lifetime of futility. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in wickedness. Well, which is it? Exactly. Because the Ecclesiastes writer is going to hold up both sides of many different topics, and they look like they're contradictory because he wants you to sit with it and ponder it and think about it and apply it to your life and then get comfortable with being uncomfortable. So it's wisdom literature. It's different from Proverbs and Job, but it's also different in its literary style, how it's written. It's so unique because whoever wrote Ecclesiastes is going to give you 2 characters. Look at Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 1. You hear the voice of the first character, as I call it. It's someone introducing you to what he called, my version says, the preacher. Chapter 1, verse 1. The words of the preacher, the son of David, the king of Jerusalem. And it starts a quote. So you have what I would say the writer, right? The person that introduces you to the preacher, and the preacher is going to start what he has to say. And like we said this morning, I'll come back to this, what Martin said. He's going to tell you what he's about to tell you. He's going to start with, in my version, he says, vanity of vanities. All is vanity. That's verse 2. And then skip to chapter 12. In chapter 12, going back to the two characters, the preacher is going to finish his dialogue in verse 8. And so in chapter 1, verse 2, he's going to tell you what he's about to tell you. Vanity of vanities. Everything under the sun is vanity. And then he's going to tell you why that is a true statement until chapter 12, verse 8. And he's going to tell you what he just told you, right? Like a good public speaker, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, then I'm going to tell you, then I'm going to tell you what I told you. Preacher finishes up what he has to say, and then he's going to hand it off to the author, to the writer, the person that introduced you to the preacher, and then he's going to pick it up and he's going to continue to the rest of the book. We're going to come back to that section in a moment, but I want you to see that as the first character. Turn back to chapter 1. In chapter 1, we have that second character. In chapter 1, verse 1, my translation says, the words of the preacher. How many people's translations say teacher? Nobody's. Okay, 1. So we've got 1, 2. That's the only 2 translations I have seen of this. But here's the thing. That word in Hebrew, remember it's Hebrew meditation literature. That word in Hebrew is kohelet. Do I have it on the screen? If I click the slide, you'd seen it. Kohelet. There it is. Kohelet means one who gathers. And so this word is connected with Hebrew, extra-biblical accounts of Hebrew for assembling. But it doesn't necessitate that it's preacher or teacher. Turn to chapter 12:9. Keep your finger there in 1:1. In 12:9, remember when the preacher hands it back to the author, the writer? He's going to say about the preacher, about Kohelet, in verse 9, in addition to being a wise man, the preacher also taught the people knowledge. And he pondered and searched out and arranged many proverbs. And so Kohelet means one who gathers. He can be thought of as one who gathered many proverbs, one who gathered all this wisdom. And so the writer is going to say, this man has done his homework, and he should be listened to. And so Kohelet was possibly academic, like an academic term, right? A collector or an assembler of sayings. But he could have been ecclesiastical, right? The book is Ecclesiastes. Or meaning a conveyor of an assembly, a preacher or a teacher, right? And so it could be either. And so the ecclesiastical is the standard word for congregation or church. It shares the same root. But I offer to you, it could also be both. And that doesn't make us very comfortable. Well, wait a minute. 2 things? It could mean 2 things, right? As Martin said, oh, God forbid, he only mean one thing for every verse or every term. Okay, let's talk about the authorship. Who wrote Ecclesiastes? We love to have an answer to this. But I'm going to offer to you, we don't have an answer to this. Turn to Proverbs, keep your finger in Ecclesiastes 1:1, turn to Proverbs 1:1. I am not trying to convince you, I'll say at the outset, that Solomon did not write Ecclesiastes. I'm not trying to convince you of that. But I'm not going to tell you he did. Proverbs 1:1. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. In verse 1 of Proverbs, we are told Solomon is the author. Oh, by the way, he didn't write them all. Go to Song of Solomon 1. Song of Solomon, chapter 1. I'll take a drink as I listen to the pages turn. Song of Solomon 1:1. You know where I'm going. The Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. Go back to Ecclesiastes 1:1. The words of Kohelet. Now, he says, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. So when someone says, I need to find out, I've got to have a name, give me a name, they're going to look for reasons to call someone by name. Ecclesiastes 1:1 is a way that you do that. You say, well, Solomon was the son of David. Okay, let me poke holes in this for a second. Son of David is not always literal offspring of David. Jesus is called the son of David 13 times. Look at your notes, Jeremiah. I'm sorry, 6 times. 13 must have come on a different thing. It's okay. All right. Well, look, it says king of Jerusalem. Well, Solomon was the king of Jerusalem. But turn with me to chapter 1, verse 16. There's a point to this, y'all. I'm not going down this rabbit hole for no reason. In Ecclesiastes 1:16, this is the Kohelet speaking. I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who are over Jerusalem before me. All who are over before you? If this is Solomon, how many people were over Jerusalem before him? 2. Saul and David. I'm not telling you it's not Solomon who wrote it, but I'm telling you there's a case to be made that it's not Solomon who wrote it. In chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, we won't read them all. It says he amassed many riches. So, it had to be Solomon. He amassed tons of riches. Well, is he really the only king who did that? Let me just tell you that it is a common Hebrew writing style to have someone who takes on a persona and then uses that persona who has authority in certain matters to make a persuasive argument. Remember that Kohelet means one who gathers, and in chapter 12, verse 9, Kohelet is said to have pondered and searched out and arranged many proverbs. In fact, it's a common scholarly belief that whoever wrote this book created Kohelet as a Solomon-like persona to use it as a teaching aid. And that's the point. Don't get distracted by the exact person who wrote it, but accept the fact that this person has the authority to give you wisdom from his experience and his folly himself. Now, Solomon does that in Proverbs. He says, my son, listen to what I have to say. I've messed it up on my own. Listen to what I have to say so you don't make the same mistakes that I did. And so is this semantics? Possibly. I will submit to that, or I'll agree to that. Solomon may very well have written it, and I'm not going to be combative about it. I'm not going to fist fight over it, right? But I'm not willing to be so sure. So if I'm going to be consistent with Scripture, I'll use the same logic I apply to Hebrews that I do to Ecclesiastes. If I'm not willing to say that Paul or Titus, or I've even heard Apollos, wrote Hebrews, then I'm not going to be so sure for Ecclesiastes. And so I'll say, the author, the writer, Kohelet, I've got plenty of options. But I bring all this up to offer it to you for consideration because it introduces a critical point on how to approach the book of Ecclesiastes. It speaks to a mentality when you go to read the book. We love to have one answer to one question, and we don't like to not know things. The test is here, can you sit with the fact that you don't have a solid grasp on something? Because that's what the writer of Ecclesiastes does to you over and over again. Let's look at another area where he might do this so we can get off the author and I can get out of the crosshairs here. We're going to talk about the word hevel. Go back to Ecclesiastes 1. You saw it in 1 verse 2. My version says vanity of vanities. It's translated many ways, but that word is hevel. Hevel, says Kohelet. Everything is hevel. The word hevel appears 37 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. In your translations, it may be translated as vanity, like mine, meaningless, or futility. In the Hebrew, it's literally translated as vapor or smoke. And so as you read the word hevel, you can apply a definition to the concept as vapor or smoke. Or you can just consider that the thing it's referring to as vapor or smoke and then ponder the implications. I know it's probably confusing, so let me break it down. Give you some examples here. In the book, you may see there are three main meanings to this word. Meaningless or vanity, kind of synonyms, right? Temporary and fleeting. Think vapor. When you're in the cold and you exhale and you see that vapor. One of my favorite things to do is go running in the morning on the retreat, and I will stop at the river. And this morning was a great example. There's a little bit of fog on the river, just a little bit of steam, a little bit of vapor, and it's a lot. It lingers a lot longer than your breath does in the cold. When that sun comes up, it burns off and it's gone for the rest of the day. So it's fleeting, it's temporary. And then the third one, which is so profound, sit with this one. When he says hevel, and your Bible says meaningless or vanity, it can mean this is an enigma. This is a paradox. Let's talk a little bit more about the smoke. Smoke, it's visible, right? Okay, so think of yourself as an Old Testament person, like in Old Testament times. We don't know solids, liquids, gases. We don't know, all the chemistry and all the science that we know now. You see smoke. It clearly exists. But then when you try and grasp it, you can't control it. It just slips right through your fingers. And you think about that as you read throughout Ecclesiastes and how that applies to so many things. So much so that the writer at some points, 5 times, he's going to pair this hevel word with a phrase. It's like chasing after the wind. You try to control it. You try to go after it. What are you doing? Stop. It's not going to work. You try to control smoke or vapor, it's not going to work. It's useless. It's meaningless. And so the application is that when you see things in life like wealth or beauty or fame, but when you try and grasp it and control it, it can change on a whim. You get wealth, stock market crashes, inflation, whatever. Beauty, get in a really bad car accident or a house fire or something, beauty can be gone in an instant. Fame, we see what happens with fame sometimes. It takes a nosedive if you get on the wrong side of a political spectrum or whatever. Life is unpredictable, and unstable. And if we try to find meaning and purpose apart from God, the author is trying to tell you that it's the smoke that you're trying to grasp. So don't do that. It's meaningless. And then smoke or vapor is also used as a paradox when referring to a particular thing because it seems contradictory or self-refuting, but upon closer examination, it reveals an underlying truth or a deeper meaning. And that's what really the book of Ecclesiastes is trying to do. Let me give you an example. In the beginning of the book, in chapter 1, the writer is going to say that in much wisdom there is much grief. Wait a minute. Why is there grief in wisdom? Wiser men than I, men and women than I, probably have a better answer than I do. But I can tell you I'm wiser than some people, and I can see the foolishness in them. The wiser I become, and I think it's natural. I'm not saying look at me and how wise I am, but the older I get, the wiser I get, and the more foolishness I see in other people. And then I go, why did you do that? That was so foolish. And so as you get, and he follows that up, this is the very last verse of chapter 1, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. The more you know, and this I can't speak to, but I'm assuming the more you know, the more stupid other people seem to be, right? There's some things you can't unlearn and unhear. If you've listened to, if you've been in churches long enough and you hear a song and you know the speed of it, and then you go to a church that just drags it down. We're marching to Zion. It's taken forever to get there. Let's march. Let's pick up the pace. We're like the Israelites in the desert, right? We're taking forever to get there. Once you know what right looks like, wrong is painful sometimes. And so vanity probably fits most consistently, back to my point. But let me offer to you that when you read the word hevel, it can mean multiple of those definitions, and sometimes it can mean all of them. I had 3 examples. I only have time for one. Let's go with Ecclesiastes 2:15. In Ecclesiastes 2:15, he talks about death being the common thing for all of us, for the wise and the foolish. He says, "Then I said to myself, as is the fate of the fool, death, it will also befall me. Why then have I been extremely wise? So I said to myself, this too is hevel." Wisdom can be meaningless in terms of, I'm still going to die. I'm just going to die really wise. Wisdom is temporary and fleeting because this life shall end, and that wisdom will pass away. And wisdom is a paradox, and I've already talked about that, so that's what I would offer to you. Wisdom can be, oh, I didn't give you the other side of wisdom. So he says that with wisdom there's much grief, but later he's going to say wisdom is a blanket, like money is a blanket. And so wisdom can benefit you, absolutely, but it's not going to save you from death. At least not until the Lord comes again, not unless the Lord comes again. So my point is, as you read the book, stop when you get to the word hevel and consider which concept or definition applies, and you don't have to pick just one. In fact, sometimes you shouldn't. Okay. Another unique thing about the book is that there's the conclusion at the end. Remember, the preacher is going to give you vanity of vanities. He's going to tell you why everything is vanity, and then he's going to say vanity of vanities, and he's going to hand it back off to the writer. Let's go to Ecclesiastes 12. The writer's going to take it back over, and he's going to say some really good things about the preacher, about the Kohelet. Got to find where I'm at in my notes before I don't get off track here. In this, he shows this masterful use of illusion. He puts images in your mind that are more effective than mere words. Look at verse 11. The words of wise men are like goads. I don't remember if we talked about it here. I remember sitting in a pew listening to this. If you don't know, the goad is the end of the shepherd's staff. So think a flock of sheep. The shepherd has a staff, and at the end of it, it's kind of pointy. And so what he would do is if a sheep got off the path, if he started to get away from the rest, because sheep are kind of dumb, I think it's going to come back, he's going to poke them with a stick, literally. He's going to goad them to go back. And so this is an illusion. The writer is giving you a mental picture of what wise sayings do. They poke you with a stick, and they get you going where you're supposed to go. The second thing he says in that verse, he says, and masters of these collections, masters of wisdom, are like well-driven nails. They're given by one shepherd. If you've ever driven a nail securely into wood, I happen to have a little bit of expertise in this matter, and the head of the nail goes just under the surface of the wood, how hard is it to get that nail back out? You got to dig and dig and dig, unless you got a special tool, right, Grace? I'll let you use it. It's a little thing that shoots it out from the other side. But if you were to try and dig it out from the head, they didn't have pneumatic tools like that back when he wrote this. You're digging that nail out, and it's a lot of work, and it's really hard. So if you master wisdom, if you master these collections and these wise sayings, you're going to be secure and solid like a well-driven nail into wood. And that's what he's saying. Pretty cool little mental picture, I think. All right, and then as we mentioned this morning in the Bible study, and I think in the sermon as well, verse 13 and 14. So if you have any working knowledge of Ecclesiastes, you probably know these 2 verses, or at least the last one. And I think that's important, and I think that is intended, because what the writer has done here is he's given you the bottom line. Now, in the military, we like the bottom line up front. We call it the bluff, bottom line up front. Here, he gives you the blitter, the bottom line in the rear. He's going to give it to you at the very last. He expects you to have come to this conclusion by the time you've gotten here. But in case you haven't, he's going to tell you, this is why everything that I've just said and the Kohelet, the preacher, has given to you, this is why all this matters. Verse 13, the conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep his commandments. Because this applies to every person. I like this morning's lesson. This is the duty of every man. For God will bring, this is the so what, this is the why it matters, right? For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. And then mic drop. That's it. He's done. That is what you're supposed to then take the book and go, whoo, what did I just read? Man. All right, I guess I'm starting back at verse 1. And that's exactly what I did for a year. Then I started back at verse 1 with that left over in my mind. You start the book over. And now you've heard me talk about this, a lens through which to see everything that was written all over again. And it's only 12 chapters. It takes you, depending on how fast you read, less than a half an hour to read it all. So sometimes I would recommend start with chapter 12, verse 13 and 14, and then go back to chapter 1, and then read it all the way through. You prime yourself for looking for the things that he talks about in the conclusion. The last thing that I'll give you about the book of Ecclesiastes is that it has many, many themes. This was my first survey after I sat down, after I had listened to it for all those times in 2024. And I sat down and I said, what are the major themes? You could add a whole lot more than this list. What are the major themes of Ecclesiastes? Lord willing, this will be my lesson next time. Minus number 5, balance in life. I think balance in life should be its own lesson. And once I'd gotten through all the other ones, I was like, well, I ran out of time. I'm not going to be able to fit more into that sermon. So that's what we're going to pick up on. But we've talked about the meaningless of life. He talks about the inevitability of death, and there's many different approaches that he takes to that. He's not telling you that to depress you. He's telling you that to make sure you keep your perspective, to keep the main thing, your priorities straight. He talks about the emptiness of materialism and wealth multiple times. He talks about balance in life. There's a time for everything, chapter 3. And he talks about the importance of spiritual things. And that's where the conclusion comes in, because you can see it, little seedlings of it, all throughout. And at the end, he smacks you in the face with it if you haven't picked up on it on your own. And so Ecclesiastes is one of my favorite books of the Bible because it keeps me grounded and humble. It reminds me not to trust in earthly things like money or power. It reminds me not to work so hard. That's probably my greatest struggle. And it reminds me to find enjoyment in the little things in life. How many times does it say it? I will tell you next lesson, but I call it the silver linings. Because he's going to tell you this is meaningless and that's meaningless and this is foolish and that's foolish, and then he's going to stop. He's going to say, here's what's not meaningless. Here's what matters. Here's where you can find enjoyment and fulfillment. Here's what you need to seek after. And so that's a little teaser for next time, for next lesson. And so I'm going to leave you with a homework assignment. I don't know when I'm going to preach next time, but I would offer to you, read the book of Ecclesiastes through, 1 chapter a day for the next few months, and apply the thoughts that we've considered today. The book is not literal. It is meditation literature that's supposed to change you, and you're supposed to wrestle with these ideas. And also consider that the word hevel may have multiple meanings. And then also see what other themes you can pick up on other than this list. And that's what we'll pick up on next time. Well, the final verses of the book are the most important, as I mentioned. And it's critical for us to remember. One day, you will have to stand before God and be judged for everything you do, as the writer of Ecclesiastes says, hidden or in the open, good or evil. Are you confident in what your sentence will be on that day? Are you ready for that day? If not, please come forward as we stand and sing.